Welcome to Conversations on Conversations, the show where each week we explore a topic that helps us have deeper conversations with ourselves and with each other. I am your host, Sarah Noll Wilson, and this week joining me is the marvelous, the magical, and I was going to say mystical, you're not mystical, but the magnificent Dr. Nika White. Dr. Nika White is a national authority and fearless advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. As an award-winning management and leadership consultant, keynote speaker, published author, and executive practitioner for DEI efforts across business, government, nonprofit, and education. Dr. White helps organizations break barriers and integrate DEI into their business frameworks. Her work has led to designation by Forbes as a Top 10 D&I Trailblazer. She is the founder of Nika White Consulting, where her firm works with organizations to identify and implement opportunities to embed DEI throughout its operations and cultures. But the thing that I want to just highlight this last sentence. The heart of Dr. White's work addresses the ability to create transformative environments with intentionality around inclusion. She helps professional spaces where people can collaborate through a lens of compassion, empathy, and understanding. And when I've read that before, I was like, sign me up for that organization. That's the place that I want to be. Welcome to the show, Dr. White.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. What a beautiful welcome. And I am just thrilled to be in conversation with you today. I support your work, and I'm so excited for us to just delve right into really courageous and intentional conversations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A former guest, we were talking about how we have our former bios, and then there's other things about us. So what else would you want our audience to know about you?
Well, I love this question. I think that so oftentimes we gravitate to what we do in terms of our position, our work, our titles, and less about what people really feel connected to. And so this question is great. I am a mother of two college kids who amaze me every day. I am a wife of a serial entrepreneur who helps me with my business acumen. And so I'm so grateful to be in a relationship with a partner that really can help me on this journey of entrepreneurship as a founder. I am a daughter of two wonderful parents. My dad is where I get my huge work ethic from. He's a first generation college student, and my mom is just amazing. She's my backbone. And I would say that besides, being a daughter, a mom, a wife, I am also someone that cares deeply about the work of inclusion and equity. And I see it as my responsibility. And I want others to also see it as their responsibility. That's part of my platform and part of why I do what I do.
I thank you for all of that, because it's so important for us to understand we play so many different roles and we have so many different places that we have impact. So thank you for sharing a little bit more of a spectrum of who you are. So for those of you who are listening, I don't remember when I became connected with you or started following you. At some point in the last two to 3 years. And there was so much about the work that you do. Pretty sure that we bonded over the fact that you were talking about not having lunch. And
That's exactly
I reached out and I said, do you need reminders? Because I need reminders. So I'm happy to be that for you. So just a little bit of backstory, and then, having the opportunity to follow your work and to learn from your work. And, this idea of, you said it, that it's your responsibility. And I would love to start as I was preparing for this and continuing to deepen my understanding of your work beyond how I interact with you on social media. There was one phrase that I think I need to get framed. And it's, if we do not intentionally include, then we unintentionally exclude. Mm-hmm. And just say more about that, because that landed on me on multiple ways. One, realizing how often I may unintentionally or intentionally exclude. And then what does that look like? And so I would love to open up the conversation from that place.
No, thank you for this question. It's an important one, and one that I gravitate to often when I'm giving a chance just to share my thoughts about this broad topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm a believer of intentionality. There's so much
Mm,
power behind that word: intent, intentional, intentionality, any variation thereof, and it has a certain look and feel about it. It is calculated, it is calibrated, it requires being strategic and foresight and being a believer of the process. It requires being action oriented. And the bottom line is that we cannot be passive about the work of inclusion. We have to be
mm,
very intentional. That is the difference and the separator, I believe, that allows us to really be able to emerge stronger as we're trying to create a more inclusive society. And so I focus a lot, Sarah, just on amplifying that we must
mm,
be intentional, because if not, then we will find ourselves unintentionally creating these adverse implications for others that they aren't deserving of. And so
mm.
I really want us to lean into not believing that this work, just because maybe we're good people, that automatically is going to organically lead to a sense of belonging and inclusion and equity, because it doesn't usually. And even if
Right.
it does, in some regards, it's not fully optimized. So if we
Mm.
want to realize the full value, let's make sure we're exercising intentionality.
Yeah. There was another word in your book that you used to describe intentionality that I underlined, and that was, and also being assertive. That it's not just thinking about it, it's not just having the good intentions, but that intentionality, and also that, you just said it, the calculated, the action oriented, the
Mhm.
conscious. And I can speak from my own experience that I think there was a lot of years where I thought, well, I'm a good person, I'm open, I'm welcoming, I'm supportive, I'm open-minded. And as I've been on my own journey of better understanding how I can be an intentional inclusionist, how I can show up differently and see differently, I realized how much I was missing out on,
Mhm.
because just walking through the world and saying, yeah, I'm a safe person, or I'm a good person. There's a lot of times that we may be creating harm. We
Yeah.
may be missing opportunities to advocate. And it made me think about, I was working with a group once, and somebody had asked the question, yeah, I mean, I know self-awareness is important, but like, why does that matter for leaders? And it was a conversation you and
Mhm.
Minda Harts was having, and we talked about, and I can't remember which of you said it, but it's, if we're not aware, we could be causing harm.
Absolutely.
And that has been seared for me. And so I would love to just hear more of your thoughts around that.
Self-awareness is critical to this work of being on this journey of learning and unlearning, and positioning ourselves to be able to reflect and emulate what we want others to model after. And so you're right, we can't be passive about this work of inclusion. It does really take us being thoughtful about how we're showing up, and to proactively plan to show up in a way that adds value, particularly to
Mm,
those who are historically excluded, and I like to say underinvested or underestimated.
mm,
I think that's where that sense of belonging comes from. And without that sense of belonging, it's hard for anyone to show up at their best in any environment. If they're questioning that, if they're questioning, do I
mm,
belong here? Am I valued? Am I seen? Am I heard? Am I safe? Do I
mm,
have full opportunity for success? And so again, a big believer of the self awareness and then the intentionality that I think plays a significant role. I coined the phrase intentional inclusionist years ago, and it's actually the title of my first book, the book that you've been referencing. And primarily, the goal was to get people to move from this place of passively saying, I value inclusion, I know the importance of
mm,
it, to then taking that value and moving that awareness to action. and
mm,
and that's really the point of intentional inclusion: is how do we grow as inclusion minded leaders? And what I find is that when I use the word leadership in the context of DEI, it's not about positionality or title. Certainly that's a part
mm, mm,
of the work of leadership, but I think that bigger than that, and more explicitly to the work of inclusion, It is about influence. And if we
Mm,
consider that, we can lead and influence from any place within the organization, regardless of our titles. And that's where I think there's such a big opportunity, because instead of thinking, yes, I value diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I see it as the responsibility and the ownership of someone else, maybe like the chief
mm,
diversity officer, manager,
mm.
director, or even the HR professional. But instead, if I know that I have a sphere of influence that I can leverage with intentionality, that I also can help be a part of creating this society that's more inclusive and equitable and a stronger sense of belonging for all. So it's subtle and it's nuanced, but I think it's powerful. And that's been a message that I have amplified and continue to amplify for years now.
There's so much alignment between our values and work. That's something that we always say is leadership isn't a role, it's an act. It's a
Yes.
verb. It's something some of us do some of the time.
Right.
And how do we do it? How do we do it more intentionally? And I think, especially thinking from it from like an organizational perspective, that's a trap that people fall into is they go, oh, well, that's just HR job. That's just a diversity, equity, and inclusion person's job. That's not my job. And one of the things that, and I can only imagine how often you encounter this in the work that you do, is how often when we talk about creating an inclusive environment, about thinking through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it's approached so transactionally,
Yes.
right? It's approached as an objective instead of a way of being. And that's
Yes.
something that I love about that language of being an intentional inclusionist and leading from whatever role you're in. And I know that one of the things that you speak to in your first book is that it's, and I wrote it down just because I want to honor your language, is promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion is more than just social responsibility. It gives us all opportunities to grow and learn from each other.
Hmm.
And I think that element sometimes gets so missed because it's viewed as this technical problem to solve, this
Right.
transactional objective, instead of understanding that it's an opportunity for us to tap into our head, our heart. And I had a client recently say, so you can move your feet. Like, let's go from the head to the heart so we can move to the feet.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious to, get your thoughts on that. And for people who may be listening, and I can imagine there are people listening who may be going, there's probably an opportunity for me to show up more powerfully. And I might be working in an organization that views diversity, equity, and inclusion through that transactional lens.
Yeah, such a lot to unpack with that question, and I love this question. So the first thing that comes up for me when you set the word transactional, I agree, and that's the paradigm shift that I'm trying to create. I think that we need to stop viewing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion as obligation, and we need to see it
Mm,
as opportunity. And when we
mm.
see it as opportunity, we are impacting the heart and the head so that we can move our feet. I love that as well. May have to use it. Um,
I'll send you her name so you can
Please.
tag her and properly give acknowledgement.
Absolutely. But, this work starts at the personal level, Sarah,
Mm,
so we tend to believe that this is just for organizations, right? At the organizational level. And that is huge because, and I often talk about, we can't just try to solve for DEI programmatically. We have to think about systems, policies, procedures, culture. That's where we're able to really create impact. And there's a keen difference between activity versus impact. Activity has,
Whoa, 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 whoa! Slow that down. Slow that down.
okay.
Because
Yeah.
I want to make sure that because you're saying it so fast, and it is like you just blew my mind in a minute. So okay, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I just
No,
wanted to
you're
give it a
fine. You're
highlight.
fine. And it is worth kind of slowing down and amplifying. I do talk fast, by the way, Sarah, but there's a difference between
Mm,
activity versus impact. Activity has a start and an end date, right?
mm,
Impact is where we take the time to really assess the situation. We peel back all the layers. We get to the crux of the matter. We identify the root causes that could be continuing to perpetuate all of these vicious cycles that we want to end. And so once we take the time to do that, I think that we're better positioned to really address a way that leads towards DEI transformation. So we
mm,
have to look at systems, policies, procedures, and culture. And, don't get me wrong, there's nothing at all wrong with, programs or initiatives. But I think that if we approach it in that mindset of it being a program or an initiative, it's only for that moment going to make an impact.
Yeah.
I want us to
Yeah.
think more holistically about it. How do we really change the course of direction to where it can be sustained
Mm,
positively?
mm,
So I'm critically always interrogating that where I can. And then the other word that comes to mind as I think about what you shared is humility. You talked
mm.
about the learning journey. I mean, even those of us who are practitioners in this space that have been in this space for 20 plus years, which is my situation, I am constantly learning every single day. I have to check myself. Everyone does. So we've never arrived. And I believe that for those who are just kind of entering the conversation, it's so important for them to also be mindful of this learning journey that has to just continue to gain momentum with every step of new data and new knowledge that we're exposed to. And
Yeah.
part of growing in this space is unlearning the misinformation that's out there
Mm,
about diversity,
mm,
equity, and inclusion.
mm. Yeah, I think that, I feel like I talk, especially when I'm talking to fellow white people, that there's this like fear of, oh, I'm going to mess up, I'm going to make a mistake. And the thing that I've again learned from my journey and from, so many great teachers like yourself is it's always evolving. I mean, we're humans. Humans are complex. There isn't this finite, simple little definition, or there isn't this simple, I'm constantly joking. Humans don't fit into 4 boxes. I know that you want to put them into 4 boxes. I know that you want to make it easy, but, and to realize that there are going to be regrettable events.
Yeah.
But what do you do in those moments? And in fact, a couple episodes prior to us talking, that was one of the things that I was speaking with my colleague Ann Tompkinson about. And she said, I realize my role is to mess up publicly and to own it publicly.
Yes, I wish more people would lean into that,
Yeah.
especially more leaders. And I am talking very explicitly when I use leaders in that context of positionality, because I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's a huge opportunity for others to realize that, well, if these stakeholders and influencers and leaders can give themselves permission to be vulnerable and to socialize that in a way, it allows others to give themselves permission to do the same.
Yeah.
So that is so critically important. And I too, like you, Sarah, I believe in the both and. I believe in the nuance.
Mm.
This is hard work. It is very complex. It's very complicated. And so there's not really a one size fits all approach. And so we have to make sure that we also are extending grace and accepting grace to those who are on this journey that are really committed to getting it right. But along the way, maybe they may have some missteps, but don't we all,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'll
Mm-hmm.
be
Mm-hmm.
honest with you, I'm not a big fan of the council culture. I'm not. I think that we need
Mm.
everyone to be a part of this conversation for us to emerge stronger. I want people to do this work because of and not despite, right? In spite of. I think that
Mm.
it's so
Mm.
important
Mm.
for us to be willing to bring people along. And I'm not saying give them a pass or an excuse and not hold them accountable, but bring
Right.
them along. Who's going to want to continue this hard work if they feel attacked, right? Or shamed,
Right.
guilted, judged, blamed? I think there's a better way to be able to help us get to a point where we all can become a part of solving for this, because that's what needs to happen. We have to choose courage over comfort, not sit on the sidelines, but choose courage over comfort.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and to your point, there's a difference between holding people accountable and engaging in conversations
Yes.
than just, because, I mean, I think about, again, my own journey or people that I work with or I'm learning, along the way with. And, those moments of missteps or mistakes, whether they were, when I really thought about it, there was some intentionality behind that, like there was a poke I wanted to make, or really like unintentionally, I didn't know and understand your lived experience to understand how what I just did was harmful.
Right.
Like that discomfort, I think that everything we do in our work, in our world, is about behavior change, right? Being really
Mm-hmm.
intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the most important and best learning moments we have is when the heat's been turned up,
That's so
right? When there
true.
is some discomfort, But if the heat's too high, to your point, if I'm attacked or whatever, then I burn, and now I go into protection mode, and now I can't be empathetic.
Absolutely.
Now I can't listen. Now I can't get curious. Not only can I not get curious about you, but I sure as hell can't get curious about myself in this moment.
Yes. I often say that when aggression meets aggression, the conversation ends. And when the
Oh, yeah.
conversation, the dialogue ends, there's no chance for us to be able to shift behavior or mindset, because now we aren't even speaking. We aren't even, communicating at all. And part of, I think, our role as those of us who really care deeply about this work, and we do want to hold people accountable, where we are attempting to call in those behaviors. And notice I said call in the behaviors, not call people out. It's because we're trying to influence the likelihood for behavioral change. And we can't do that if we lose that rapport and that level of respect and communication.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's, something I was just referencing your work this morning, talking to a colleague of mine, and how there's a focus of yours, or at least how you described it in the book, of you pay attention to the quiet ones in the back.
Yes.
They're because if we think of behavior change, I like to look at it through that, I forget what it's called, but it's like literally the behavior change model of pre-contemplative. I don't know that what I don't know. I don't even care that I'm not even thinking that I don't know, to contemplative of, to then planning and taking action. Right. And everyone's on a different journey with that. And I appreciate it and love that idea of, well, who are the silent champions that are sitting out there? Who are the people who are, they're curious, but maybe they don't know how, they're not sure, maybe they don't have the courage yet. And listening and paying attention to, engaging those voices as well. And so I would love to hear more thoughts from you, on that idea of like paying attention to the quiet ones in the back.
Yeah. Well, I think that's critical because, again, it goes back to my philosophy of, I think there's a large population of people that at their core, if you were to engage them, they certainly can communicate the value and the importance of DEI, but they're passive about it. They're quiet. They don't see that they need to really engage in the work. And I am not a believer of taking energy and investing it in the attempt to try to persuade someone who is really already completely set on this mindset in life of bigotry, hatred, prejudice, discrimination. I feel like there's a much better chance for us to garner greater championship and ambassadorship and support of DEI if we connect with those who are just quiet and maybe on the fence and just don't know how to engage. They're passive. And so that's been my philosophy around this journey. And I also believe that resistance is a lack of clarity. Resistance is a lack of clarity. And so
Say more about that. Yeah, continue.
So if I am going to try to bring someone along that I perceive as thinking that DEI is just a distraction and it's unnecessary, to me, my first question is, how can I understand better about their lens and their knowledge of this broad body of work? Because to me, that resistance has a lot to do with just the unawareness, the ignorance that's there. And I use that word ignorance to really just talk about the unawareness of, based upon maybe someone's lived experience, how they've never had to navigate anything that caused them to feel compelled to want to lean into this more. So we have to share stories. I'm a big believer of storytelling and getting, to know people below the surface, to where we can understand what their lived experience may be, and then be able to reflect on that against our lived experiences, and then believe them in a way to where it helps us to feel empathetic and compassion and be called to action around support and care. And so I think that sometimes it's also an issue of the lack of clarity that maybe we aren't attuned to as allies and advocates of this work, that we need to pay closer attention to.
It's, one of the core practices in my book is that we call it the curiosity first approach. And it comes from the fact that so often when I was working with people, navigating, relationship conflicts or disagreements, is how not often, how little people took the time. I mean, for two things that were opportunities to get curious about themselves, right? You know, through their own discomfort. So if the topic of diversity, equity, inclusion makes you uneasy, well, instead of just shutting down, get curious about it. What can you learn about yourself, and that unpeeling and being courageous to consider that you might discover some things you don't want to about yourself as you're reflecting it. But then the other side is like genuine curiosity about the other person, and to like you and I are very aligned from the standpoint of everyone's got a story. It's not the goal isn't to create their story, but to remind yourself that it is. And I think so often, you know, and I think, you know, naturally we do this as humans. We look at the world through our lens and our lived experiences, and how critical it is to honor the fact that your experience is your experience, and other people have had totally different experiences. And sometimes I think people can be quick to shut it down or minimize or negate or say, oh no, that didn't really happen, or whatever the case might be. Instead of, because here's the thing, I don't know anyone who would be like, oh, I'm not empathetic. Oh, I don't care about people. Oh no, I wouldn't want to step in someone else's shoes. But the act of that is an act of courage, because it may reveal something that may be uncomfortable for us, right? That we have to wrestle with now. But what will open up for you, you know, going back to that point of it's an opportunity for us to learn and grow from each other.
Mm-hmm. You know, Sarah,
it's only going to deepen your experience.
I so agree. You're speaking my language. I think it's because we shy away from discomfort. We always want to be comfortable. And I think that actually hurts us as a society, because we try to stay in that level of comfort. And we know that growth occurs when we are outside of our comfort zone. You know, I am very quick to be able to, if I'm socializing with a large group of people and some experiences come forth, and especially if I'm like the only lonely, and saying, I don't see myself in that example, or that's not my experience. And I think that's important. We have to be willing to shed the light on that difference, right? And I also believe that curiosity, to your point, is so critical. It's actually one of our core values at my company, NWC. We talk often about, you know, the need to seek understanding first before we assume, before we react, before we even solve, you know, and being those lifelong learners with great level of intentionality around, you know, being in search of opportunities to deepen our knowledge and to grow our skill sets. That's really critically important for us. And when we lean into our curiosities, I think that it positions us to ask better questions, right? I think that we are a society that we rely more heavily on making definitive statements and not enough asking thoughtful questions to really understand and learn and grow and interrogate what we're hearing and process what we're hearing. And so yes, you're speaking my language.
It's and partly because that's what's been rewarded.
Yes.
We've been conditioned that there's a right answer on the test. We've been conditioned, right? Like our whole culture has been set up for, you know, either the binary or the limited thinking. And we've been rewarded for that instead of asking the questions. And, you know, and for me, when I think about curiosity, it's this deep understanding that I'll never know. There's always something I don't know. There's something I don't know about me. There's something I don't know about you or about this experience. I want to go back to the example you shared of, well, I want to tease out two things. Let me write the other one down so I don't lose it. So, because part of the intention with these types of conversations is to find those moments where we can give people examples of what it looks like to show up in moments perhaps differently, and maybe questions of reflection. So I want to highlight that example you shared of, I don't see myself in that example. Yeah. And it's so powerful. I know I've had moments where somebody met a really, really amazing person through that lens that happened on Twitter, actually. Neha, who a Sempath, who we're going to be interviewing her next week. And yeah, she's incredible. And I shared something that was benign. Let me clarify. It felt like a simple statement, right? And And then she said, and the statement was, just for clarity, was, and we don't get to decide if we're trustworthy or not, right?
Yeah.
Other people do.
Others decide
And
that for us. Yes.
not that it's a wrong statement.
Right.
And what she added on was her perspective as a woman of color, as an immigrant. And we have to understand that, people hold bias against some people to basically and not everyone is even given the trustworthiness because of who they are, what they look like.
Of course.
And it was such a powerful expansion. What would you say, or what might be a question that somebody who's listening to this and is like, I don't know how to step into my discomfort. What are some of those reflection questions? For me, what's coming up is one, just even noticing and naming, this is uncomfortable for me.
Exactly.
Maybe even listening to this conversation. So what might be some reflection questions or things that you would invite somebody who's towing that line and unsure or doesn't know how to step into that discomfort?
Another great question, Sarah. And one of the things that I use often with many of our clients, or even just other groups that are convening to build community and to have a clear understanding of the lens that every person brings to that environment is, in this safe space. And I use those words loosely because, just calling a space safe is not what makes it safe. Obviously, it's about the people in the space feeling like they can show up very bravely, but generally speaking, it just provides this opportunity where people are asked to share no other formal agenda, but just share your DEI story, share the lens in which you show up to this work of DEI. What are those intersecting identities that helps you to think the way that you do, interact the way that you do, to make decisions the way that you do? And just in hearing people reflect on that alone is so powerful because it connects everyone to this uniqueness that they bring to that environment. And there's something really beautiful and powerful, and it gives people agency to feel like that's okay. It's okay that I'm different. It's okay that my lens is shaped by these experiences that may be different from yours. And I think through that, this learning occurs that is informal and organic, but it is so powerful and useful. And it breeds about this deepened level of curiosity, going back to that word of wanting to know more, and then seeing our colleagues and our friends in a light that's not as their title and their position in the organization, but more as now a person, a human.
Yeah.
And it's just, so I mean, honestly, it's not really a question. It's just a prompting of, can we create this space for people to show up bravely, to be able to talk about the intersecting identities that they have and the lens in which they show up and they think about broadly the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah. I was thinking it, and then you were just saying it, is like we walk around and, we have these labels we assign to ourselves or to other people, right? Whether it's their title, whether it's, a label we've created for them, and how do we, and it's always remarkable to me how powerful it is when we can be connected at a human level.
Yeah.
And it seems like, well, yeah, no, I know they're human. It's like, yeah, no, I know, but there's a lot of things that might be limiting that. And so that opportunity to be open to and connecting, and, and I think what I would add is, and if you're in those moments, again, like noticing what comes up for you, right? Like noticing what emotions come up for you, what thoughts do you have, and to get curious about it, because otherwise I think what can happen is, oh, I'm uncomfortable and I shut it down. Oh, I'm uncomfortable and I project onto you, right? I get frustrated that we're talking about this, so I shut it down, instead of like, how do we expand this moment as an opportunity to learn about myself and also to learn about other people.
I say that all data is opportunity, not right, wrong, good or bad. It's just opportunity. We get to choose what we do with it. If it's something to reinforce, then that's great. Let's build up that momentum and that traction. If it's something that we need to shift and change and modify, that's still opportunity. So let's just see it as opportunity. And you said something a moment ago. It was about, we don't necessarily always see each other as humans, right? And that's so true. I often share that we, especially in the work environment, we see each other as resources, not as human. And we have to remember it's about human resources, but the human comes first. And the other thing that I will say too, it goes back to the questions that we can engage around in the safe, brave space community for people to really unpack their intersecting identities and how in which they believe DEI should be manifested by their own experiences. But two other questions that I often will share is, what do you never again want people to say, think, and do about your group, speaking about your identity group? And then what do you value that you want people to know? Right. And then I often share with everyone is we're just hearing people tell these stories because, as you can imagine, oftentimes it can be quite triggering. So you have to make sure that you have a community of supporters that are willing to stand in solidarity and really just be that encourager. But as people start sharing these stories, they're letting their emotions flow, whether or not they intend for it to or not. Sometimes they just flow. And when it does, it is hard in that moment to see a person across from you and to see them as a resource without, having that deep level of humanity and care to just really just overtake the environment and the situation. And then what I often say to the rest of the people that are listening, intently listening while the person is sharing, is that then we have a responsibility as we hear this information. How can we now arm ourselves through this information with ways that we can combat whenever we find ourselves witness to or victim of someone saying these things that we've heard? I never again want people to say, think, or do XYZ about my group and about my identity. And so it takes some practice, and it takes certainly having a couple people in that space that know how to navigate these complex conversations, as you can imagine. So I don't at all want the listeners to just feel like they can go and just try this at home, but it is incredibly powerful when it's done well. Yeah.
And even, I imagine that if you aren't experiencing or if you're not a part of a facilitated experience like that, that, what's coming up for me is, and when is somebody telling you that without directly telling you that? Like how can you listen for that? And how can you, again, honor and believe and trust and, so how can you be listening for those, and it might not be explicit. There's a couple of stories that are coming up for me right now that I'm thinking about, but
well, let's think about the example that I mentioned earlier. I don't see myself in that example. How often do we find ourselves a part of conversations where people are making generalizations about certain identities, or again, they're gravitating to those stereotypes? If I'm a part of that group and I'm in that setting, just to simply say, I don't see myself in that example. Tell me more about that. Why are you thinking along those lines? Help me to understand your perspective. Or even if we just were to not tiptoe around it, but be emboldened enough, if we feel brave in that moment, to say, I find that offensive. I'm letting you know directly, And not everybody has the agency in every circumstance and situation and environment to go there. I get that. There's so many different elements about the situation that could cause someone to not feel like it's safe to do so. So I do want to honor that. But for those who have that agency and they are able to, there's absolutely nothing wrong with then just in the spirit of boldness, being able to say that. And I respect you enough as a colleague or a friend to let you know that that's offensive. You would, and I hope that you would extend the same courtesy to me if some of my actions or words were creating harm for someone else.
Yeah. It goes back to, in the book conversation that you and Minda had that we were able to attend is, nobody benefits from your caution, but so many can benefit from your courage.
Yes.
And that's, I think that's for me why, as somebody who is an in progress reformed avoider, right? Like I'm still working on it, still building up those muscles, but, and also, like that's an opportunity too, for people to go, I didn't speak up. Like, let me get curious about why. Did I not because it wasn't safe? Did I not because I wanted to protect something for myself, right? I just hearing a story this week. I was talking to somebody after a keynote that I had given, and she was sharing with me some of the racial trauma that she had experienced, and And she said, and nobody spoke up. And she said, and I didn't know if people saw it or not, but she said, when I left, what I heard was, one of the coworkers said, do you think the boss is going to treat us like that now that she's gone? So it was like, so this person saw it, they knew it, but there was some sort of there was some kind of self-protection mechanism. And I think I would imagine, when I think of the idea of being an intentional inclusionist is I got to get real honest and willing to consider what are the reasons, assumptions, beliefs, things that I'm protecting, especially like I say this as a white woman, that are keeping me from doing this. Mm-hmm. That's more than just me not knowing, but like, I'm actually benefiting from this. And I've got to be willing to reflect on that.
Oh, absolutely. Self-reflection is so important, as is self-awareness. But, I think it goes back to also the realization that bias doesn't make us bad people. We all have it to some degree, and there's a spectrum of it that exists out there. But it also does not, Sarah, exonerate us from the consequences of our actions. So that's where I feel like you don't have to own the intent, but it is important as an intentional inclusionist to own the impact. You can step on my toe and tell me that you're sorry. And I can very well believe that you did not mean to step on my toe. But then guess what? My toe still hurts, right?
Yeah.
So what are we going to do about that? Yeah. And I also believe that silence is a message as well. And it's not always the intended message. So if we're witness to this harm and we stay on the sidelines quiet, then we are sending a message that either we condone it, either we are tone deaf and it just really just went over our head and we didn't even realize it, right? Or a variety of different things. But I believe that one of the opportunities we don't talk about as much is, it's one thing for a victim to have the self-agency to want to protect themselves, but what about those who are witness to these situations? What's their responsibility? How are you feeling called to action in that moment, right?
Yeah, and I think about it through the, again, that self-reflection of, not just why did I stay silent, but what did my silence say?
Absolutely.
Like,
and I
that's
think
so powerful.
And I think that's also why May of 2020, after George Floyd's murder, so many organizations had this heightened awareness and sensitivity to needing to make a statement. And I don't say it that way to criticize, because I understand the complexity of being in that moment in time, right? And because it was so visual, it was so hard, it was, the whole world was witness to it, that you couldn't help but to feel like, I have to do something in this moment, right? And so, but what a lot of organizations who missed the mark did was say, that's not my lane. I'm going to let the social justice folks kind of deal with that. I'm going to stay in my lane and be quiet. And the assumption was that what's happening outside of the four walls of our organization is not impacting the people who show up to our organization to give their best. And that was totally misguided, because it was. It absolutely was.
Yeah.
So silence is a message.
And continues, right?
Yes.
Like, and certainly, I know there are people, leaders who are in those formal positions of power and authority who are, they're focused on the productivity and they're focused. But again, I go back to, there's not as many people who would consciously say, I don't care about people, that, I wouldn't want them to feel safe. I wouldn't want them to feel valued and accepted. And, and that's actually something I would love to spend just a little bit of time on with you, that difference between appreciation versus acceptance and valued. But to, again, recognize this we're bringing our whole selves to the table, and to just go back to that quote that we started with, that if you are not intentionally building that culture of safety, that culture of belonging, if you're not doing the work to explore for us, we do a lot of work with people around, like, what am I doing that's getting in the way of the very thing I say is important to me? Because sometimes we can't just put our foot on the gas. We have to figure out what part of us has got our foot on the brake, and what assumptions are we making, and, and how do we untangle that and unlearn some of that, or at least recognize that that's there. And that I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but just that idea that it's not enough to just, well, that's not going to affect us.
Yeah.
No, it is. And are you okay? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, are you really okay that somebody in your organization doesn't feel safe?
Mm-hmm.
Are you really okay? And that's, it's a real question that I think people need to ask. I want to, one of the things that I loved how you split out that, this idea of inclusion, especially when we think about it through an organizational lens, but, people are listening to this and I want it always to apply to personal too, of that it isn't just enough to appreciate somebody or to appreciate our differences, but that we create an environment where they're accepted and valued. And I would love to just hear you tease out those differences as we're coming to the end of our conversation.
To me, it's about being active versus kind of passive. I akin it to inviting and welcoming. It's subtle, but there's a difference, right? I can say, okay, this event is open to the public. Anybody can come. But if I am noticing that, historically we've had this event and there's so many, segments of our community that are not partaking and enjoying this experience, but now I am intentionally kind of reaching out to those individuals well beyond the time of need or the opportunity, but I'm building and cultivating those relationships. I'm making space for them at that particular event in a way that's meaningful for them. I'm not placing the burden on them to have a good experience, but I am getting their input to make sure that as I am planning the experience to include them, that it can be meaningful and enjoyable. So there's a difference, subtle, but there's a difference between inviting and welcoming. And I think it's the same about, appreciating difference, or at least saying it, which, can be quite, just rhetoric. But when we're actually providing a space and we're incorporating different touch points that really speaks to that, it deepens really the credibility of someone's intent on really ensuring that those individuals feel safe, accepted, valued, celebrated, welcomed. And so it's subtle, but I think it's really important distinction.
Thank you for that. I know we're coming down to the end of our time. I have so much more I want to talk with you about, so we're just going to have to bring you back at some point.
I would love that, Sarah.
I want to ask you our final question that we ask everyone, and that is, what's a conversation you've had with yourself or with someone else that was transformative? And you can share whatever you want to share around that conversation with us.
And so you prepared me for this question. So I did spend some time thinking about it. And it's a great question, by the way. And I had a different answer until today. So we do an Intentional Conversations podcast. And my guest this morning was actually Brittany Janae Harris. And she has these liberated love notes that she makes available. And she talks about how important it is to answer the question, who are you from? Not where are you from and who are you, but who are you from? And I was so drawn to that conversation, and I was hanging on to her every word, but that was transformative for me. And the reason why is because hearing her talk about the beauty and how she was honoring so many of her ancestors and how so much about them is infused in who she is and how she shows up to the world and how she's so grateful for that. And that grounds her was really instrumental for me to hear. And I found it to be just very transformative. And so now I find myself thinking about, because Sarah, if you consider the fact that oftentimes when we encounter people, we ask, well, what do you do? Who are you? Where are you from? And it's always about, connecting our identity to what we do. But when she said we need to start answering the question, who are we from and why that matters, I was really drawn to that. So that's my answer for today.
I love it. That gives me literal goosebumps. We will share that episode. If you are okay with that, we can add it into our show links so people can go back. And just for, for those of us who are listening, who want to connect with you, who want to learn from you, who may want to hire you and bring you and your team in, what is the best way people can connect with you, Dr. White?
Oh, the easiest way, Sarah, is through our website, which is simply nikawhite.com, nikawhite.com. We invite you all to reach out. We have lots of courtesy resources that we make available. It's our way to show up to the world of all those learners who want to deepen their knowledge and understanding of DEI. And so we hope that you will take us up on some of those courtesy offerings to deepen your knowledge. And I just want to thank you also for having me today. It's been such a joy. You've been such a great supporter of me personally and of NWC and our work. And I just want you to know that I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the release of your new book. Excited for you and all that's to come, Sarah. And just look forward to continuing to be in conversation in a multitude of ways going forward.
Likewise. Thank you so much. And we will share all of that information in the show notes. I highly recommend you do follow Nika and the work that they do. You have a weekly vodcast that I highly recommend. And just watch how she introduces those shows, because your intentionality in those moments is always so clear. And so a huge heartfelt thank you again for showing up and stepping into this space with me. I'm going to be really thinking about that. Who you from? That is I have a whole list of things.
Isn't that great? Who are you from?
No, that's good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Conversations on Conversations. I know that I so enjoyed and am thinking deeply about the conversation that I was just able to have with Dr. White as we explored this idea of how to become an intentional inclusionist. Something that I'm going to hold on, well, there's two things that I'm going to hold on to from this conversation, amongst others, but the two I want to name is, first, that idea of being an intentional inclusionist and realizing that when we're not intentionally including, we're unintentionally excluding. And I know that that's not the impact I want to make. The other was that point about silence is a message. There are times when I have been silent. There have been times when I was afraid to speak up. There have been times when I wasn't sure what to say. And realizing that in my inactivity of being passive, of being silent, I was sending a message, and it sure isn't the message that I want to send. I look forward to hearing what resonated for you. And as you think about and explore your own world, if you are interested in holding more deeper, more meaningful conversations with others, or if you just simply like to connect with us, you can check us out at sarahnollwilson.com. You can also find me on all the major social media platforms. My DMs are always open. Also, you can pick up a copy of my book, Don't Feed the Elephants, where books are sold, which is my love letter to my fellow avoiders. If you'd like to support our work, visit us on patreon.com/conversations on conversations, where as a patron of our work, not only will your financial support sustain this podcast and the incredible team that does this work, but you can also get access to some pretty great benefits like some unique swag and Patreon-only content and events. You can also subscribe, rate, review to the show. Having more reviews out there is helpful for us to get the word out and to be able to bring on amazing guests like Dr. White. Finally, I just want to give an incredible thank you to the team who makes this podcast possible, to Drew Noll and Nick Wilson for the editing and producing of the show, to Olivia Reiner for helping with transcribing, and to Caitlin Summit Nelson for all of her marketing support. And my deepest gratitude to Dr. Nika White for joining us today, for sharing with us not only her passion and her work, but helping us all learn how we can be more intentional inclusionist. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us. I hope that you rest and rehydrate and stay well. Bye, everyone.